sanctions are very strong. They're the strongest sanctions we've ever imposed.
Those who want us to compromise with the U.S. draw a groundless and unfounded plan. The U.S. is on the decline.
Sanctions are coming. With a tweet, the U.S. president launches new economic sanctions on Iran, including an oil embargo. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Monday marks the first day of a new wave of economic sanctions on Iran. This time, the U.S. government is focusing on Iran's biggest export, oil. But it's granted temporary waivers to some of Iran's biggest trading partners. The U.S. Secretary of State took to the Sunday talk shows in the United States to explain the American position.
These sanctions have already had an enormous impact. We've already reduced Iranian crude oil exports by over 1 million barrels per day. That number will fall farther. There's a handful of places where countries that have already made significant reductions in their crude oil exports need a little bit more time to get to zero, and we're going to provide that to them.
Notably left out of the waivers, the European Union. Despite a close alliance with the United States, the EU issued a strong rebuke upon announcement of the new round of sanctions. The EU is also working hard to maintain the Iran nuclear deal that the US pulled out of last year. For Iran's part, the country isn't taking the latest move by the United States laying down. Iranians took to the streets over the weekend in protest at the sanctions. The government said it won't be cowed.
We should completely break these sanctions, and will do so with the help of God, with the help of the people, and with the unity in our society. We should make the Americans understand clearly that they cannot talk to the Iranian nation using the language of force, threat, pressure, and sanction.
Joining us now to talk about this latest development from Tehran is Mohammad Marandi. He's a professor at the University of Tehran. With us in the studio is Negar Mortazavi. She's an Iranian-American journalist. From Berlin, Matthew Karnitschnig is chief Europe correspondent for Politico, and John Sitilides is geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors, a firm specializing in international security, government affairs, and political communications. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's start in Tehran with Mohammad Marandi. And Dr. Marandi, these are the latest sanctions, of course, imposed by the United States. They've now kicked in. It will affect Iranian oil exports, banking, and even imports of food and medicines. What's the mood in Tehran or in Iran over these latest sanctions? Are people bracing for the worst?
Well, I think the psychological warfare that was being carried out by the foreign-funded Persian language media, including BBC Persian, VOA, Iran International, which is funded by MBS, and other such outlets. A few months ago, they were effective in creating a fear among Iranians, and there was a rush for people to purchase foreign currencies and goods from the market. But I think that campaign has losses its effectiveness, and even though they've been attempting to recreate this sense of fear, we've seen no change in the currency market over the past few weeks. In fact, the rial appreciated slightly recently, and the markets are all normal. So I think the Iranians recognize that this is the new norm. The Americans are going to try to make Iranians suffer as much as possible. But I think that the Americans so far have already shown that they have not had the success they wanted to. The very fact that they admit that Iran is exporting 1.6 million barrels a day is significant, and I believe that Iran is probably exporting a lot more than that, but through alternative means.
Negar, of course, Iran is a country that's weathered sanctions before, but is it any different this time?
I think it is less effective. I would agree with Mr. Marandi to some extent, because the United States, not because they don't want to put as much pressure or not because the Iranians are more defiant, but because the U.S. doesn't have the international support that President Obama did. The Europeans have broken from the U.S. on this issue. Even Russia and China and some other Asian allies of the United States are not on board, because these sanctions are basically a violation of the international deal, of the U.S.'s end of the nuclear agreement, while Iran has been compliant with its nuclear responsibilities. So it is not going to be as effective, but it is going to take a toll. The toll is going to be first and foremost on the people, on civilians, on children, on women, on patients who are in need of life-saving medicine, which is going to be all affected by especially the financial and banking aspect of the sanctions.
John, what's the U.S. goal here with these sanctions, realistically?
Well, the stated goal is obviously to bring about behavior change by the Iranian regime, right? There are several major goals here in terms of trying to prevent Iran from ever developing nuclear weapons, from ending its quote-unquote malign activities in the Middle East and elsewhere, including assassination attempts in Europe, and also to prevent further development of its ballistic missile program, which itself is a violation of UN resolutions. So that's the stated series of goals. There are some who would argue that the logical outcome of all of these sanctions, especially those that might come in a next wave or series of waves, would be to bring about regime change in Iran.
But, things like Iran stopping its ballistic missile program, those things were not in the JCPOA. That's the Iran nuclear deal.
Exactly, and it's one of the reasons why the critics of the Iran deal were so vociferous in the U.S. Senate back in 2015 when President Obama entered into an agreement with the Iranian government and the other powers. They made very clear that in the event there was a Republican administration that adhered to their own criticism of the deal, they didn't care that Iran signed on to a deal. They thought it was a bad deal from the beginning. And one of the reasons that they see Iran so happy with the deal is because it works in Iran's favor, even if it doesn't accomplish long-term goals of stemming that nuclear weapons development program.
All right, let's go to Matthew in Berlin. And Matthew, the European signatories to the Iran nuclear deal and other countries in the European Union as well are not on board with these sanctions. In fact, as we reported earlier on, in a rebuke to the US, European countries said they, quote, deeply regret the US action. So how deeply has this split the United States from its traditional allies in Europe?
Well, I think it certainly split them on the surface, but at the end of the day, the European allies remain very reliant on the United States for their security. Most of the big companies that initially went into Iran after the JCPOA have now pulled out because they're also reliant on the American market. So there's a bit of a realpolitik at play here where the U.S. is able to push its agenda with the Europeans, even though the Europeans are resisting and they're making statements and voicing their opposition to this move. But in reality, there's very little that they can do about it, which is why I think that these sanctions will be much more effective than we heard at the top of the program.
Dr. Marandi, do you agree that these sanctions could be much more effective?
No, I don't think so. First of all, it is true that the Americans are trying to harm ordinary Iranians. The objective is to make ordinary Iranians suffer, and that, I think, shows the brutality and the nature of the regime in Washington. Obviously, the Iranian government is a powerful government. We have 15 neighbors. We have strong relations in Asia. And if the Europeans lose the Iranian market, the Asians will be picking that up. And Iran's position in the region is also stronger, and it has stronger regional allies. The reason for the sanctions, though, are not because of Iran's nuclear program. There never was a nuclear weapons program. I think Gareth Porter's book, Manufactured Crisis, points that out to, if your readers read it. And Iran's missile program does not violate UN resolutions. And the very fact that Iran is surrounded by roughly 45 American military bases is the reason why Iran has a robust military program. U.S. invasions of Iraq, the destruction of Libya, support for extremists in Syria, the destruction of Afghanistan. I think it's more than enough reason, the millions of people that the Americans killed in this process, it's more than enough reason for the Iranians to have a robust military defense program.
Right, John, Matthew makes a point there that, the Europeans may be making noises about this development by the United States, but ultimately they will get on board. They're not going to do anything to undermine this. But what about the optics of this? Doesn't the United States look right now that it's isolated? President Trump is standing alone.
No, I don't see that at all. As a matter of fact, if you look at Europe, there's actually a split inside of Europe. European CEOs don't care about the political idealism of all of the European leaders who want somehow to maintain a bridge to the Iranian economy. For them, it's a bottom-line approach, and I think the administration understands that. They're the ones that are pulling out regardless of what their own governments are encouraging them to do or to not do. So the split really is not between Europe and the United States, it's between European government leaders and European company executives. But again, as I mentioned earlier, this is not the threshold event. Trump is the negotiator. This is one stage. There's more to come depending on how effectively these other countries are able to move out of their Iran contracts.
Negar, the United States says in imposing these sanctions that it's targeting the Iranian leadership, not the Iranian people. But when we look at things like medicines and food that are going to be affected, it will affect the Iranian people, wouldn't it?
Of course, it has affected the Iranian people in the past. We have architects of sanctions from the President Obama era who actually put these sanctions in place originally, who are now admitting that these sanctions had a direct toll on the Iranian people, on civilians. This time around, it's going to be the same. And there are two big fallacies coming from the U.S. administration here. One is that they're claiming that they're with the Iranian people, they're not targeting the Iranian people with these sanctions, and that's not true. The sanctions are going to take their toll first and foremost on the civilians. And the second is that they want Iran to come back to the negotiating table. But Iran had been at the negotiating table with the U.S. administration, the previous one, and they made a deal, and this administration didn't abide by it. So why would the Iranians come back to the table is the question. And also the fact is that the Iranians are not coming back to the table for any kind of negotiations with the U.S. So the two major I would say claims of the Trump administration about these sanctions are incorrect, and also the fact that he doesn't have the international support behind.